What if surviving the greatest battle in history was actually a fate worse than death? Imagine coming home a hero only to realize your life is over. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button. In the autumn of 480 BC, a Spartan warrior tied a rope to a ceiling beam inside an empty house. Nobody came to stop him. Nobody entered the house. Nobody had stepped inside for days. His name was Pantites, and he was one of the legendary 300. He actually survived Thermopylae. Every other Spartan who marched to that pass was dead. King Leonidas was dead. The three-day stand against Persia was already becoming the most famous military sacrifice ever. Pantites was only alive because his king gave him an order. He followed it, finished the mission, and went back to Sparta, expecting to give his report. But Sparta refused to look at him, not because he ran away, but because he obeyed. Doing what you're told when everyone else chose to die was the one crime Sparta could never forgive. But here's the crazy part. There was a second survivor, named Aristodemus, also sent away by Leonidas on strict orders. Yet Aristodemus got something Pantites never received, a second chance. What Aristodemus got and Pantites didn't is the exact reason one man lived to die on a battlefield, while the other died alone with a rope. This is the part of Thermopylae nobody tells you. The surviving stories are just what empires want you to hear. The hidden ones, the orders that became crimes, the obedience that became treason, the survivors who weren't supposed to come home, vanish unless someone tells them. So hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Crimson Historians is where these buried secrets surface. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Let's go back to Thermopylae, August 480 BC. The pass is incredibly narrow, just a strip of dirt between the mountains and the sea, barely wide enough for one road. Leonidas holds it with 300 Spartans and a few thousand Greek allies against a Persian army stretching to the horizon. King Xerxes has between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers. History books disagree on the number, but everyone agrees nobody expected the Greeks to hold. Yet, they held for 2 days. On the second day, Leonidas pulled Pantites out of the line. The order was clear. Travel north to Thessaly, deliver commands to allied cities, organize backups, and check troop spots. It was standard military communication and completely necessary. So, Pantites left the pass, carrying his king's orders. You won't believe what happens next. That night, a local Greek named Ephialtes showed the Persians a secret mountain path around the pass. By dawn on the third day, Leonidas knew they were surrounded. He sent the allied Greeks south, keeping only the Spartans and a few hundred Thespians and Thebans. They fought until every weapon was gone. Spears broke, swords shattered. Herodotus says they fought like wild animals with hands and teeth in the final hour. Leonidas fell. The Persians took his head. Every Spartan who stayed at the pass died. Meanwhile, Pantites was walking a quiet road in Thessaly, carrying orders, doing the exact job his king gave him. He wouldn't find out what happened until days later. Then he walked back to Sparta for his report. He had no idea this walk home would take longer than the rest of his life. We're back in the dusty streets of Sparta, late summer 480 BC. Dirt is still on his cloak as Pantites approaches the city gates. The first men he sees are guys he trained with, boys he grew up beside in the military camp. They're the same men he ate with at the communal mess hall, where every Spartan sat down to the exact same meal on the exact same bench every day. Which part of his journey has surprised you the most so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments because his story is just getting started. When their eyes met his, they moved right past him. No anger, no hatred, just nothing. Not a single person greeted him. Within hours, he learned the horrible truth. The 300 were dead. Leonidas was dead. The pass had fallen on the third day. Every Spartan who stayed fought to their last breath. But then he learned something else. He was not the only survivor. A man named Aristodemus had also been sent away before the final battle. Aristodemus caught a terrible eye infection during the march, leaving him temporarily blind. Leonidas sent him back with the supply wagons, medically unfit to fight. Both men followed orders. Both came home alive. Both walked into Sparta, thinking that obeying their king's command meant they were safe. Neither man was greeted. If you are enjoying this story so far, smash that like button. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Pantites tried to enter the communal mess hall, the place where citizenship was proven every day. In Sparta, eating together was not a tradition. It was the law. A citizen who did not eat at the shared table was not a citizen. He sat down. The bench instantly emptied around him. Men who had trained beside him for years kept talking, ignoring his presence. Their eyes looked right through him like he was just furniture. He ate. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody looked at him. Nobody told him to leave. They acted like the bench was empty. He watched Aristodemus get the exact same treatment, the same empty bench, the same conversations buzzing around an absent body. Aristodemus sat with his head down and accepted it. Pantites saw something in his posture that told him exactly how this would end. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. But to understand what Pantites saw, you have to understand the brutal system Sparta built for men just like him. It was a system created centuries before this battle, with a specific name. There was a word in Sparta for men who survived battles when their unit did not. They called them the tresantes, the tremblers, men who trembled before death and chose life. The punishment was not informal, it was legal and codified. Being a tresantes was a legal category with specific restrictions touching every part of daily life. A tresantes could not marry. In a society where having kids for the state was a main duty, this removed his purpose. He could not hold office, vote in the assembly, speak in public debates, sit at the communal hall as an equal, or train with full-status citizens. But here is the crazy part. The shame was made visible. A tresantes was required to wear a torn cloak, not a plain cloak or simple garment. It was the same cloak he always wore, deliberately ripped so every citizen who passed could see the damage and know what it meant. He was required to shave half his beard, one side of his face bare, the other grown. This uneven look was meant to be grotesque, making his face a public record of his failure. He walked through Sparta as a living warning. Young boys spat at his feet. Instructors used him as an example. His own children were taught to look away from him. The humiliation was constant, daily, and visible to everyone. You won't believe what happens next. The system had one feature that made all of this survivable. There was a way out. A tresantes could redeem himself in the next battle. He had to take the front line, seek out the most dangerous position, and fight until his shame was erased by courage or erased by death. Either outcome was acceptable to Sparta. Which one of these punishments surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. Both options returned a man to honor, and this was exactly the path Aristodemus would eventually take, but it would cost him everything. At the Battle of Plataea, 1 year after Thermopylae, the Greek alliance faced the Persian army for the final time. Aristodemus volunteered for the very front rank. He broke formation, charged ahead of the line, and fought with a wild fury that every Spartan recognized as something other than courage. He was not trying to win, he was trying to escape the awful category they had placed him in. He died in that charge. Afterward, the Spartans debated his death. Herodotus recorded the argument. Some said Aristodemus had redeemed himself. Others argued his death was not courage, but desperation, a man seeking his own end for personal relief, not for Sparta. They denied him the honor of the war dead. But here is the crazy part. The debate itself was the point. Aristodemus was discussed, his name was spoken, his death was analyzed, weighed, and judged. The system gave him a category. The category gave him a visible path, and the path gave him an ending people would argue about for decades. If you're enjoying this so far, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. But let's get back to Pantites, because you won't believe what happens next. Pantites received none of this. No formal charge, no coward status, no torn cloak, no shaved beard, no category at all, just complete silence. The difference between Pantites and Aristodemus was not what happened at Thermopylae, it was what happened at Sparta. Aristodemus had a disease, an eye infection. It was a physical, visible, medical reason for leaving the pass. Leonidas could point to the infection and say, "This man cannot fight." That decision had a defensible logic that did not touch Leonidas's judgment as a commander. Pantites had a direct order. He had a mission, a task assigned by the king for strategic reasons. And this was the massive problem. To admit that Pantites was following a legitimate order was to acknowledge that Leonidas sent a man away from the pass. It meant the sacrifice of the 300 was not entirely voluntary. At least one Spartan left because his king told him to leave, not because he chose to go. Now this is where it gets incredibly interesting. By autumn of 480 BC, Leonidas was no longer a king making decisions. He was a martyr. He was the architect of the 300 sacrifice, the sacred center of everything Sparta would build on the foundation of Thermopylae. The propaganda was already forming. 300 men, all dead, all willing. Every Spartan who marched to the pass chose death freely, accepting it as the highest expression of the code. This was the version Sparta needed, not just for Spartans, but for every Greek city-state Sparta would ask to fight under their command in the coming months. The myth of the 300 was not internal propaganda. It was a strategic asset. It made Corinth trust Spartan generals. It made Athens accept Spartan leadership. On the battlefield, it made smaller city-states believe Spartan discipline was worth the cost of alliance. A messenger following orders did not fit that story. Sparta faced a contradiction it could not resolve in public. If Pantites was disloyal for leaving, then Leonidas was incompetent for sending him. If Leonidas was wise for sending him, then Pantites was loyal for obeying. Both statements could not be true in the same narrative. So, Sparta chose a third option. Neither statement was made. Pantites was not charged, not exonerated, not discussed. The contradiction was dissolved by making Pantites disappear. No trial, no formal accusation, no acknowledgement that the messenger existed. Which part of this cover-up surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments. The psychological precision of this invisible punishment was absolutely brutal. Aristodemus could handle the official system of shame because it finally gave him a name. He was a trembler. The word gave him a solid wall to push against. It was a tangible thing to fight, a status he could theoretically reverse by showing bravery on a future battlefield. But here is the crazy part. Pantites had nothing to fight, no charge to answer, no status to escape, and no path to any battlefield that would clear his name, because Sparta refused to tell him what he did wrong. He existed in a grey area the system didn't have a category for. He was a man who followed orders, only to come home and find that following orders was the crime. Except no one would say it out loud. The punishment was absolute, except there was no official punishment at all, just total absence. Picture Pantites standing in the Spartan assembly, waiting for his turn to speak. He watched the leaders conduct business, watched his name not appear on any lists, and watched the order of speakers announced without him. The city had simply decided the easiest solution was to pretend he never returned. He went to the dining hall again and again. Every time, the bench emptied out, but not in a dramatic way. The men beside him simply stood and moved to other seats without a word. The conversations continued around him. His food was served, he ate, he left. Nothing changed, and this ghost-like routine continued for weeks. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Something separated Pantites from Aristodemus during those weeks. It wasn't courage or weakness, it was perception. Aristodemus believed the strict system would eventually process him. He thought this treatment had a time limit, and if he endured the torn cloak, the shaved beard, and the silence long enough, a battle would come, a chance would arrive. For all its cruelty, the system had a hidden clock built into it. His shame had an expiration date measured in blood. By the way, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Pantites understood that no clock was running for him. He watched Aristodemus bow his head and accept it. He watched him walk through the training grounds in his torn cloak while boys spat at him. He watched Aristodemus sit at the edge of the dining hall, eating his food without meeting anyone's eyes. Aristodemus was acting out his degradation the way a man serves a sentence. Head down, wait for it to end. It will end. But wait until you hear what hits Pantites next. He had no sentence to serve. The silence surrounding him wasn't a structured punishment. It was an empty space with no edges. He couldn't tough it out to the other side because there was no other side. And he figured out something else that Aristodemus wouldn't understand for months. The silence was permanent because it had to be. Sparta could never acknowledge Pantites. Not now, not in a year, not in a decade. Because acknowledging him meant admitting Leonidas had sent men away from the pass. And Leonidas was sacred now. His decisions were scripture. The sacrifice of the 300 was the foundation of Spartan authority in Greece, and that foundation could not have cracks. Pantites was a crack. Every day he walked through Sparta, every time he sat in the dining hall, every time he appeared at the assembly, he was a living reminder that the story of the 300 wasn't what Sparta claimed. His body in that city was evidence, and the only way to remove the evidence was to make him invisible. Pantites did not die because he was overwhelmed by shame. He did not die because the heavy silence broke him. He died because he understood the cold, hard logic of his position with absolute clarity. The silence would never end. The silence could not end. The whole city would just look right through him until they didn't have to anymore, simply because he wouldn't be there. That rope wasn't about despair. It was the final answer to an argument Sparta already made. He executed himself because Sparta made that the only way they'd ever acknowledge him again. His passing was the one thing the city couldn't pretend wasn't happening. So, Pantites died inside his house, totally alone, using a rope tied to a ceiling beam. Nobody ever entered. But here is the crazy part. The historian Herodotus, writing 35 years later, recorded his tragic ending in just one single sentence. Pantites strangled himself. One tiny sentence buried inside 600 pages. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit subscribe and tap the bell right now so you don't miss the next part. When Herodotus wrote his histories around 445 BC, he worked directly from Spartan sources. He spoke with real veterans of the Persian Wars, officials who kept state records, and men who actually knew the 300 personally. Those sources handed him absolutely everything about the Battle of Thermopylae. They detailed the brutal three-day stand, the shocking betrayal by Ephialtes, the secret mountain path, and that dark final morning when King Leonidas knew the end had come. They described Persian arrows blocking the sun and Spartans fighting with broken weapons. Herodotus wrote down speeches, names of the fallen, and the poetry carved into their monument. He got all of that in crystal clear detail. Now this is where it gets really interesting. For Pantites, the Spartans gave him just 2 sentences, a name and a method of death. No context, no explanation, no account of his mission to Thessaly, no story about his return, and 0 mention of the silence. Compare that to what they gave him about Aristodemus. They provided a massive, detailed paragraph. They talked about his eye infection, the debate over his cowardice, his glorious comeback at Plataea, the frontline charge, and arguments about whether his death counted as true honour or just a fancy suicide. Aristodemus got a full story because his journey supported the code. It proved even survivors can redeem themselves through death. The system works. But you won't believe what happens next. Pantites received 2 sentences because his story broke that code. A warrior following orders, destroyed for obedience. There was no way to frame this as justice, so they framed it as nothing. But this erasure went way deeper than silence. It infected the text itself. Herodotus wrote Pantites into Book 7, Chapter 232, 2 sentences, the messenger to Thessaly, the suicide by hanging. Fast forward to Book 9, Chapter 71. When Herodotus describes Aristodemus fighting at Plataea, he calls him the sole survivor of the 300 from Thermopylae. The sole survivor. He had written Pantites into his own history 5 books earlier, and by Book 9, he either forgot or no longer believed the guy was real. This wasn't a mistake. This perfectly showed the shape of the legend Sparta was building. But here is the crazy part. This story became the absolute rock of Spartan credibility. It built the Greek alliance and grew into something massive. The political need was urgent. After the mountain pass was lost, Sparta needed every Greek city to send troops for the huge battles still to come, like Plataea and Mycale. To make this work, they needed total trust. The other Greeks had to believe Spartans never ran away, that dying was better than failing, and their code was unbreakable. If you're enjoying this so far, smash that like button. Now, you won't believe how a simple messenger almost ruined this. A soldier just following orders made the story messy. It showed that some of the 300 were regular guys doing a job, taking commands instead of acting like magical heroes who wanted to die. The fake propaganda version needed all 300 men to gladly choose death. It needed them to walk into that tight pass, knowing they would never walk out. One guy carrying letters back to Thessaly because his boss told him to, that completely ruined the perfect story. The funny thing is, sending messengers was a sign of a really smart general. It meant keeping in touch with allies and making sure the cities down south knew to get ready. King Leonidas was just doing a great job as a commander. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. The exact same smart leadership that made his battle plan great made his sacrifice look less perfect to storytellers. But the fake myth was way more useful than real tactics. That myth won them alliances and kept Sparta in charge of the Greek army for decades. It made 300 dead guys stronger than any living army. And that myth had to be perfectly clean. Everyone had to be dead and willing, with absolutely no messengers and 0 survivors who went home on orders. Poor Pantites was thrown away for this myth, exactly like the 300 were thrown away at the pass. The difference is, the 300 knew what they signed up for. Pantites found out the rules way too late, sitting alone in a city that refused to look at him. Wait until you hear what happened to the story next. The tale of Thermopylae changed from real history into a giant legend very quickly. By the time Alexander the Great came around, the 300 were already seen as perfect soldiers. By the Roman era, they were the main example of brave sacrifice. During the Middle Ages, kings across Europe used this exact story for their military rules. And in modern times, from the 1962 movie to the 2006 film, the story is locked in place. 300 men, all dead, all amazing heroes, and 0 mention of any messengers. Aristodemus only shows up in tiny footnotes as a weird fun fact, the survivor who eventually made up for his mistake. Pantites does not show up at all. The loyal man who followed orders and had his life ruined does not fit the cool story, so the story leaves him behind. Now this last part is truly mind-blowing. If you go to Thermopylae today, there is a big monument with a bronze statue of Leonidas, a stone list of the 300, and a famous poem. Pantites is not on that stone. Aristodemus is not on it either. But a man named Eurytus is. Eurytus had the exact same eye sickness as Aristodemus. Both were sent away from the fighting. But when Eurytus heard the final fight was starting, he forced his servant to guide him right back to the front line. He fought completely blind, and he died right in his spot. Which forgotten soldier surprised you most? Drop it in the comments. He is on the monument. That memorial was built in 20th century Greece. The state was building heritage sites. They carved the names the legend demanded. The men who stayed, the men who died, the men who had an easy story to tell. But here is where it gets really interesting. There is another monument, one Sparta could never control. Herodotus wrote 2 short sentences about it in his 7th book around 445 BC. Those words were copied onto paper, scrolls in Athens, then onto heavy parchment in Alexandria. Later, Greek monks copied them by hand in the 9th and 10th centuries, keeping the words safe through the fall of Rome and the dark years that followed. Italian scholars copied the manuscripts again in the 15th century. Finally, a printing press in Venice printed the first Greek edition in 1502. Every single copy carried those two sentences. Every writer who saved history also saved Pantites. Not because they knew him, not because they cared what his name meant. They did it because the book was Herodotus, and his work was worth saving. This forgotten soldier's name just happened to be inside it. Sparta tried to erase him forever. The myth tried to erase him. Even Herodotus lost track of him later in his book. But the page survived. Now, if this hidden history changed how you see things, share this with a friend who loves a good mystery. The stone at Thermopylae says they died following Sparta's laws. But Herodotus says one of them did not die there at all. He died weeks later in an empty house with a rope, following the final order his city gave him, which was silence. Both facts have been true for 2,500 years. Only one was carved into rock. Modern armies still teach the exact lesson Sparta wanted. Death before shame. Never leave a man behind. Mission first, always. They ignore the confusing orders. They ignore the impossible trap Pantites faced. Follow the command or die with your unit. No one teaches the dark lesson Sparta buried. Obedience means absolutely nothing when the legend needs you to disappear.